Welcome to Find Your Center, the Weight Loss Surgery Show. It's Dr. Tizian. Today's episode, I want to talk to you about the concept of dysregulation. So if we look at what the definition of dysregulation is, it is really the abnormality in the regulation of a metabolic, physiologic, or psychological process. Obesity, the disease obesity, is a dysregulation of our physiologic process. Okay? So it is a dysregulation. So going back in time, kind of looking at this in a sort of grander scheme or perspective, in 1960 to 1962, 13% of our population suffered from class 1 obesity, or at least 50 pounds over what their healthy body weight should be. And now this stayed pretty consistent until about the late 1980s. Between 1988 and 1994, that number increased to 23%. Now, just to be aware, these are numbers from the CDC, or the Centers of Disease Control, not numbers that I've made up. I've pulled that from their website there. And what happened, though, is that now, in 2018, more than 40% of our population suffers from class 1 obesity, or at least 50 pounds over their healthy body weight. That is more than a threefold increase in the number of patients suffering from obesity over a time span of 58 years. Now, our genetic code, our genes, the things that make us human, there's about 20,000 different genes that actually determine who we are. That's it, 20,000 genes. More than 5,000, or 25% of those genes, are dedicated to the control of our fat mass, our metabolism, our overall weight, and how we process food. So it's a significant portion of our overall genetic code is primarily responsible for our weight. So why is that important? Well, in order to understand how that really impacts us, we have to go back in time about 200,000 years ago, when the first humanoids were really on this face of the earth in Africa. There was only about 1 million of folks alive at that particular time, and it stayed that way until about 10,000 years ago at the sort of advent of the agricultural revolution, sort of the first time that we were able to no longer hunt and gather, that we had a more steady food stream available to us. As a result, the population went from about 1 million folks that were wanderers, gatherers throughout the earth to 170 million folks on the earth. Now, this number continued to climb slowly, steadily over a time period, and into about the 300 years or so ago, there was really now 800 million folks on the earth. And this is sort of the advent of the mechanical industrial revolution. And from this point on, our population really takes off and explodes. And so what we start to see is more modern medicines, more modern techniques, more modern industry, the start of processed food, cannings of food, etc. And by 1950, we're now at 2.5 billion people on the face of the earth. Now we go into our third major revolution at this point, which is really the food revolution. The hyper-processing of food now becomes more commonplace and becomes sort of the norm. And so our population gets affected by all this. And over a time span of another 50 years, we go from 2.5 billion people on the face of the earth, adding another 3.5 billion, more than doubling of our population in a time span of 50 years. And now creating a population that's now more than 7 billion. And that's directly attributed to this plethora of food that we now have. So no longer do we have to hunt and gather, eat twigs, berries, kind of forage for our foods. We have a steady stream of food. But our genes really think it's 200,000 years ago, and more than 25% of them are designed for us to store food, because that was something that was a survival advantage. And so our bodies, again, as the last episode discussed and talked about, was this fat mass set point, carefully regulates our overall fat mass, or our body mass. And it does a nice job of that and tries to balance that within 100% every year. And if we were able to do that, we wouldn't gain weight, we wouldn't lose weight, we would stay pretty neutral. Our hunger, our appetite versus our overall metabolic rate would match and would balance. But because of the types of foods that we are eating, and as I said, the things that influence our fat mass set point, one of the most important things to realize is the abnormal constituents of food that we now eat is commonplace. The high doses of sugar, the high doses of fats, the high doses of salt, as well as the numerous different antibiotics, pesticides, herbicides, and other preservatives that are placed into our food impact our overall fat mass set point. And that's actually only off by 1 to 2% a year. However, being off by 1 to 2% of our fat mass set point actually translates to a weight gain of 2 to 4 pounds per year. Now, it does not seem so bad, but if this process is starting at the age of 10, by the time that somebody is 50, they've now been exposed to this for 40 years. So their weight is going to gain by 40 to 80 pounds, or put them at the point of being just about obese, or smack dab in the middle of class 2 obesity, or a BMI of 35, or 80 pounds over what their healthy body weight should be. The longer that we are exposed to this weight, to the exposure to these abnormal constituents, the more difficult and more challenging it is for us to lose weight. And so our brain, our fat mass set point, is dysregulated. And when fat mass has moved up, or that set point has moved up higher and higher, it becomes dysregulated. It begins to defend that fat mass as if it was the norm for that. And so a lot of folks will say that we are not overeating and becoming obese, but we're becoming obese and then we're overeating to fill that space. And why is that so? Well, it's because the food and the abnormal food constituents are driving us to have higher and higher levels of insulin, higher and higher levels of other hormones that are pushing us to store more fat, and to the point where our blood and our bloodstream actually seems devoid of nutrients. And so our bodies actually believe that we are starving even though we are gaining more fat mass. So we are eating more because we are hungry more, and our metabolisms are slowing down because our brain is perceiving itself as having an area, or living in an area of food deprivation. So anyway, that's sort of where we see this dysregulation come in, and it becomes a bit of a challenge. One of the best ways to try to avoid it, again, eating more natural, more fruits, more vegetables, lean proteins, good, healthy diet, but more on that to come. In the next episode that's coming up, we're going to talk about the concept of calorie counting and why that's a flawed way of trying to lose weight, and a lot of that will tie back to this concept of dysregulation. As always, thanks for listening, and again, please feel free to email me or leave comments on our Facebook page or the Twitter account, or through email as well that can be reached through these web pages here. Thanks. Stay tuned for more podcasts from Find Your Center, the Weight Loss Surgery Show. Thanks for listening.